I'm very conflicted about Jedi Survivor. On one hand, it has some of the best Star Wars content in gaming currently, where you can see a very solid roadmap of a great trilogy in the making, which gets me excited to see how the third game wraps Cal Kestis' story. But on the other hand, and performance issues aside, there are some design choices that I wasn't a big fan of in the first game that were brought back and seemingly doubled down, which soured a bit of the experience, but I had to put those feelings aside to enjoy the rest of the package, which is really compelling. I'll say this though, Jedi Survivor is almost the perfect sequel. It's bigger in its content, from mechanical variety and narrative nuance, bolder in its confidence to further play around with the Star Wars lore and all the facets of its design, but flawed when it comes to refining and perfecting gameplay systems flaws by adding more on top of it, and I'll gladly talk about what I mean by this when we get there. Before we touch any positives, we have to address the big elephant in the room first, which is the technical state of the game. As you've seen by now online, the game's technical stability is a mess at the moment. On PC, the game is poorly optimized, taking poor advantage of high-end rigs, and the statement Respawn released a few hours later felt like a cop-out. The consoles don't fare much better, with both quality and performance modes suffering from issues across the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles. From my experience, here are some of the issues I've encountered throughout my playthrough. There wasn't a single hour or two where I've never experienced screen tearing on the regular, performance issues not just in game but in cutscenes as well. I had an encounter with enemies where they just disappeared from my sight and the game automatically killed them, and then when I came around to their bodies lying outside the battle arena minutes later. UI prompts glitching after leaving the menus, models most likely clipping causing this weird flicker to the texture, a ton of stutters, this weird issue I had with the shadows, ghosting caused by the ambient occlusion, which is mostly derived from the game's lower target resolution of a range between 600p and 800p, and then using AMD's FSR upscaling technique to reconstruct to a 1440p-ish image, but low resolution target causes a lot of grain to be present on screen since each frame is being reconstructed, thus not really helping with image clarity. Incorrect object positioning in a cutscene, but I've only seen this once. And finally, and I genuinely do not know whether this is a stylistic choice or a bug, but the aspect ratio in cutscenes sometimes tended to shift from an anamorphic aspect ratio to a full screen 16:9 ratio in the most unnatural way possible. Now, for the most part, when it comes exclusively to frame rate issues and screen tearing, I am mostly unbothered by these issues because I am an individual who still plays older games on the regular, like PS2 and PS3 era games, and some of those games, especially from the PS3 era, have a ton of performance issues. So much so that I'm kind of numb to it, like picture playing the first Infamous game on the PS3, you're running and jumping across rooftops and all of a sudden the frame rate just tanks hard out of nowhere. I just scoff at it because I know it's temporary and I can tolerate it, but while I may be insensitive to it, which spoke true of my entire playthrough using performance mode exclusively, I also have to acknowledge that my standards are vastly different from most of the general public, and for a €80 product, it's very inexcusable the state the game launched in, especially when said developer has a reputation of releasing polished experiences. And speaking of the developers, I don't blame them because as a game designer myself, no developer in the world wishes to release a bad product, and I feel for the team who's currently hard at work addressing these issues. This is more of a fault of the publisher who gets to decide when the game is released, regardless of the state it's currently in. So if you feel mad, and rightfully so, about the amount of money you paid for the product you received, just remember that the devs never intended for you to experience the game like this, and most of the fault rests on the higher-ups, who pushed the game to release in this state. Similar to what happened in Cyberpunk 2077, where the dev staff constantly told management that the game is nowhere near ready for release, and as a result, it almost tanked CD Projekt Red's reputation for quality standards and communication trust. Now that we got this out of the way, let's talk about the content itself, and there are tons to talk about. The game is visually striking. Even though I'm not a hardcore Star Wars fan, one of the things I've always loved about the movies is how visually striking the environments are, not just the planets but the cultural density that inhabits alongside its citizens. It's been a while since I've played Fallen Order fully, and I don't have a clear image of the inhabitants of each planet, as the levels were very linear, with a larger focus on puzzle solving and combat arenas with Metroidvania progression, so having such thing is far from ideal. Maybe besides Kashyyyk, where you get to see its inhabitants more at war, but I digress. Here in Jedi Survivor, you actually don't globetrot as much as the first game, even though both games feature the same equivalent number of planets, with some of your playtime being spent on both Koboh and Jedha, both being this greater approach to more hub-based worlds, similar to the newer God of War games. This approach, as beneficial as it is for a more cohesive and character-driven story like this game, the presentation somewhat suffers, mostly due to the lack of unique locales, but don't get me wrong, the few varied places that still exist in these planets is enough to make each stand out, like the outpost, the forest, both the vast and intricate layouts of Jedha, and more striking ones I wish not to spoil. The cinematography in cutscenes is also really well composed when it comes to lighting, camera angles and framing, given most of your playthrough will be blurry because of the upscaling technique. When the game shifts to a cutscene, it really does everything it can to deliver a very clean and precise image to make you appreciate the smaller details on display, which is a perfect approach when you're tackling a very story-driven franchise as Star Wars is. For example, there's this cutscene at the end of the prologue with the camera positioned outside the Mantis wing. And this one where depth of field is beautifully used for close-ups or when it's the perfect time to introduce a new element to the scene, which is an excellent attention to detail. Speaking of attention to detail, this time around Cal is more agile than in Fallen Order, and his animations encapsulate perfectly some of the growth he has gone through. More specifically, the minute animations and transitions that give it that extra visual satisfaction. There are so many, from how he lands depending on the height he jumped from, how he transitions from walking and hanging from pipes, one of my favorites is when you're wall running and if you're close to the ground without jumping or leaving the wall, Cal does this cool spin transition and he keeps on going. And finally, the greatest animation change of all time is the running animation, where gone is the rushing to the bathroom animation from the first game and in is the time to get business done. Like I said before, I played the game in performance mode, and while I expected the visual hit for a more solid frame rate, the use of FSR with the lower resolution target really does not do wonders to the game, and most of the time you can see the game trying to reconstruct frames for a cleaner presentation, but the samples aren't enough to deliver that, and what's worse is that it can cause a lot of visual noise during gameplay. And when you compare it to Fallen Order, the image quality is so much cleaner there, although it's a last-gen game, so I hope that with time Respawn improves on it. Circling back to world design, the level design deserves praise. Levels on Fallen Order were pretty expansive in terms of density, with many shortcuts and secrets as it stood under the Metroidvania umbrella. Jedi Survivor remains the same, but this time around, thanks to the more limited size of most planets, the ones you do engage frequently within Koboh and Jedha are very massive. Matter of fact, Koboh alone could be at least 3 or 4 or even more Fallen Order maps in one in terms of size, which wouldn't surprise me if that was the actual metrics, as I'm just guessing. This somewhat echoes God of War Ragnarok's Vanaheim realm, where not only you have the forest, but also the huge crater to explore. When it comes to the linear missions themselves, the game doesn't disappoint, giving us some of the most intricate and well thought out layouts the series has seen so far, as it interweaves platforming and combat arenas seamlessly, and with exploration, the Metroidvania elements remain, with some areas only being accessible after significant story progress has been made. I really do love the approach the team took here in striking a very nice balance between world size and density, and the traversal just enhances the appreciation for the complexity at display. Signposting is also pretty clever most of the time. With so many mechanics for traversal, the game takes a brilliant approach in not relying on the Uncharted yellows and Tomb Raider whites 100% of the time, with each environment featuring a very cohesive and repetitive element for memorization's sake, whether it be vertical lines for jumping upwards and sliding, horizontal lines indicating wall running, and grid-like patterns indicating climbable surfaces. It's something I actually didn't notice until I was rewatching some of the clips I recorded, and the environmental designer deserved kudos for that. By the end of Fallen Order, you have a strong moveset to play around with. It was already perfect, but somehow those wizards at Respawn managed to improve what was already good into something that makes the game very twitchy, and for the better, as these larger areas should be complemented by a character who can speed through them in ample time. Added to your new arsenal is a grappling hook, meter dashing, and some really cool quality of life features like extending wall runs on the same wall. When strung together, the myriad of combinations you can induce present these mechanics as tools more than just options, as you can clearly see them in use during the traversal challenges, where you have to come up with creative ways to get to the goal, and during combat, where that brings a very high degree of freedom in movement and positioning, something I'll touch upon in a bit. And in the bigger picture, this is a design element that really benefits from these changes and additions. And all of this coming from a developer with platforming experience from their Titanfall series, it's such a delight knowing they still play around with those traversal elements. Environmental puzzles I'm a bit mixed on, to be honest. I love puzzle games, and over the years I've been leaning towards puzzles where multiple solutions lead to the same outcome, no matter how you executed them, which is why Breath of the Wild and the immersive sim genre are some of my favorite styles of game design. Jedi Survivor being more aimed at a mainstream audience, I never expected the puzzles to be super complex or multi-layered, but I really wish it had some complexity in terms of treating the items and usage as tools more so than objects, kind of like Sims to a certain degree. For example, here's a clip of me doing this puzzle, where I need to take this sphere out of this room to outside by burning these vine-like minerals blocking my path. At first I thought, okay, given the laser is pointing outside, I could just use BD1 to create this long line that allows me to burn it from the outside. Well, that didn't work, because the water was blocking the way, and even if I thought of redirecting it somewhere, the waterfalls were placed high enough and a small creek placed in between the objectives made this method unachievable. So, the next idea was to throw the ball through the gap between the waterfall and vines. Of course, this would have disrupted the entire puzzle solution in hindsight, but I deserved a shot. I tried that, and to my surprise, there's an invisible wall that just blocks it. And I was disappointed, not gonna lie. I eventually found a solution, but it got me thinking that the puzzles here would really benefit from more sim elements where it at least allows us to have some degree of freedom when solving puzzles. When it comes to more general stuff, there's a really cool base management component where you can recruit people who then add more elements to it, like growing a garden if you're so inclined, having some music play around the saloon, bounty hunting, play a very fun game of holotactics where you gather enemies from scanning them and they'll duke it out in a chess type game. The accessibility options menu, while it does a job, it's pretty simple in what it offers at the moment. Respawn has promised more options in future updates, but right now, I say it does enough and more options would enhance the way people play the game. In terms of side content, the game is massive, but its approach can sometimes be pretty mixed. From fetch missions where you have to go to X and investigate or gather something, to ones where there's entire map segments designed just for an ability or upgrade item for you to learn and make use of in your playthrough. And last but not least, customization is pretty fun. I don't believe I went for more than 3 to 4 hours with the same outfit, and whenever I could, I would customize my cowl when I could. From a Nirvana fanboy that runs a fan page, a beauty model inspired by the same set of clothes Luke was wearing during his training with Yoda in the swamp in episode 5, a bounty hunter with the most comfortable set of clothes one could ask for, to a martial artist and freerunner practitioner who has been donning his mastery as a lone warrior for centuries. The option is not just for clothes, but for hair and facial hair as well, and it was enough to keep me engaged with the exploration that rewarded me with such, which, by the way, it's a very cool way of approaching exploration and rewards as the sole driving force. The moment-to-moment game feel is so freaking good, like, no joke, this is some of the best feeling third-person action adventure currently, and part of that is how the new gameplay mechanics reflect how much more nimble and twitchy Cal is when moving from A to B, or during combat encounters. I actually went back to Fallen Order and played the first few hours just to gather some footage for comparison, and what struck me the most is how sluggish the game feels compared to Jedi Survivor. Not in a bad sense, but the speed sensation and transitions in animation and attention to detail feel very slow and heavy, which caught me by surprise. In this game there's so much subtlety to appreciate, from his running animation and the subtle camera wobble accentuating the weight and speed, the wall running transitioning smoothly whether entering or leaving, and combat, which is close to reaching that bar but not quite. The combat framework in the first game went for a Souls-like structure, while introducing its own elements to be its own thing, and if we were to view that in a spectrum, it sits right in the middle. Combat in that game felt a bit sloppy, to be completely honest with you. While it did its job, it lacked precision and fine-tuning, and most of your time, Cal was just flinging his lightsaber like a maniac, as if he was using it for the first time. This could have been for story reasons or the fact that Respawn was doing a game of that type for the first time, but the point still remains. Here in Jedi Survivor I'm very divided. On one hand, the new stances are such a welcoming addition, and having such a diverse toolset enables for greater player choice the way they want to tackle a scenario. But on the other hand, the balancing feels way off when it comes to hit registration, parry windows, animation locking, and dodge windows, giving a very finicky feeling, a similar problem Fallen Order suffered from. And instead of refining, they doubled down, and as a result, we have a really great and solid combat system that I genuinely had fun with playing on master difficulty, but the lack of a more refined balance really holds it back from being the greatest it can be, and this is mostly apparent when fighting humanoids and non-humanoid creatures. When you're fighting with humans, the system feels perfect. The balancing was tailor-made for this class of enemies, and as a result, it really leads to some of the most frenetic battles you will have during your playthrough, and I love it a lot for it. When you're fighting with creatures, that's when the combat framework sort of breaks, and suddenly, your dodge windows and distance don't compensate for the huge swings thrown at you 100% of the time. Sometimes the hitboxes can feel really unfair, and some of the damage outputs are insane to think about, like 2 to 3 hits and you're gone. I get that it's to represent how powerful these enemies are, but in doing so, you don't get enough time to process and learn the creature's moveset, unless you're either really persistent or you just want to lower the difficulty to have an easier time. To be more clear and precise with what I'm talking about, I do feel said finicky feeling comes from how loose movement is unless you're locked into an enemy, and a lack of weight can sometimes result in imprecise attacks, where it's easy to misjudge the density of your attacks. And I really wish it was tighter but not heavier to still maintain its identity. A good example of this is Bloodborne. Entirely different games in terms of game feel, I know, but in Bloodborne, you have greater precision input of your movement, and when you're in a really tight spot, you have enough control to avoid incoming danger or dodge because the lack of animation locking during attacks, besides visceral, doesn't punish you for relying on dodging too much. A good comparison is a fight you have with the Rancor in the mines in Jedi Survivor and the fight against the Cleric Beast in Bloodborne, both larger than the main protagonist, and it takes place within a tight place. The Rancor fight is not fun, I'm sorry. 2 to 3 hits, then escape, rinse and repeat gets tedious because it's brutally unfair. In Bloodborne, however, you have so much precision around your movement and attacks that it allows you to have more control in how you position during that battle. By the way, I can't deny that there's mastery to be had here when all the systems click, and don't be surprised when you see people speedrunning the game in Grandmaster with 0 hits as their main objective. And I reiterate that I had a lot of fun with the combat, with the multiple stances like Blaster becoming my main for how precise it is instead of single just flailing around, some of the combos you can string alongside the Force, and many more other elements at play. But I just can't shake the feeling that it could have been better if said refining took priority to really make this game meet its potential, because as it currently stands in the spectrum I mentioned earlier, it feels as if the game took 3 steps forward towards being its own unique thing, but in doing so it took 1 step backwards for not addressing some of the looser elements of the first game. I'm also still not 100% sold on the checkpoint system, simply due to the type of game this is. But it's weird because most of the frustration I had with Fallen Order were addressed here, and I really enjoyed them. but Star Wars being a more light-hearted game where you have to rush to the boss if you died compared to a Souls game where you really need to be aware of how your situation has to be by dying and having to trot back to the boss, the feeling just isn't there for Jedi Survivor, which sometimes sucks the fun out of. I may be sounding like a hardcore FromSoft fanatic right now, but I promise that the Souls game has some fascinating design decisions, and if you're going to take a jab at that design framework, just bring what you truly need to your game and what you find beneficial, instead of just carrying that entire structure and expecting it to work seamlessly. Having said all of that, I do hope that with the third game, Respawn gets to really work out some of the kinks this structure currently presents, and I can't wait to see where they take it, for better or worse. I'll keep this section brief, because at the time of writing this, it hasn't been 2 weeks yet since the game launched, and I really want to respect the pacing people are going through when it comes to spoilers and some of the big surprises towards the end of the game. So I'll say this. I genuinely fear we're currently experiencing a perfect trilogy in the making. The first game was a clear origin story, where we follow Cal as he came to learn and grow as a Jedi after being on the run and in hiding for so long. Here in Jedi Survivor, the stakes are much higher, where not only there's a new threat to deal with, but throughout the game, Cal deals with the temptations of the dark side through the many personal affliction he goes through the story, and you'll often get to see how he and those around him deal with that scary scenario, which isn't perfect 100% mind you. The first hours are very slow. Matter of fact, the pacing in the first 2 acts feel really slow. I mostly blame this on the level design because as good as it is, they are very long and beefy. Long to the point that each mission averages at around an hour or 2 depending on your skill level, and sometimes it can feel that the story is going nowhere. But rest assured that these 2 acts serve as a build-up that hit a massive climax at the start of the 3rd act, and let me tell you, when I wasn't convinced on the story in what were almost 10 hours of playtime, the pacing drastically picked up and stakes kept rising to the point where I was not just fully engaged with the narrative, but I was also confident that the writers are really confident in where they want to take the story. Not just for emotional stakes, but for significant nuance and character drama to present within every single word written for this game. The performances are also a highlight, with Cameron Monaghan as Cal bringing his A game and delivering one of the finest performances of the year, and his range gets to shine with the script given to him. Deborah Wilson and Tina Ivlev as Cere and Merrin are also my personal highlights, with Cere still being this very strong mentor figure who Cal looks up to as he did in Fallen Order, and Merrin with her very monotone voice still being one of my favorite character traits, and now that she has a larger emotional range, she really blossomed into a character I grew to like every time she was on screen as the game progressed. Equal love goes to the many new NPCs you can chat to, with Skuva.
Forgive the short greeting, lad. I'm always on edge when fishing for the finger-lipped Garpon.
Doma.
Well, take a look, you'll find the finest components and sundries this side of the Outer Rim.
And Pili being one of my favorites to chat with when I get the time to.
I'm Cal. This is BD1.
I'm Pili. Didn't expect to see any pilgrims today.
I really had a blast with the game. Performance issues aside, as those will get patched eventually, as sad as it is to say that line, there is a lot of meat in terms of content here when it comes to presentation, whether it be the environmental design or the animations, the gameplay with its masterful approach in platforming, the want to be more puzzle design, and the somewhat divisive combat to the narrative itself, which I strongly feel is some of the best Star Wars content we're getting currently. It's definitely an amalgamation of various elements that click really well, but I just don't feel the game is quite there yet. Regardless, I'm already on the train, joyfully seeing the trajectory this trilogy is going towards, and I can't wait to see how it concludes. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe, share with your friends, and activate the bell so you can get notifications of my latest video. And thank you for watching.